In some of my previous videos in this series, especially the second and third ones, we've looked at how many interpreters, especially in the last century or so, read Genesis 1:1. They don't read it as a complete sentence or an independent clause, but as a dependent or subordinate clause. So in order not to have a dangling sentence, they have to locate the main clause or the independent clause of this sentence in either verse 2 or verse 3. In a later video, we'll talk about whether this seems like a viable way to construe the syntax. The traditional way to read Genesis 1:1 is, of course, as an independent clause, in other words, as a complete sentence. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, full stop. I'm characterizing this as the traditional reading because it's the oldest translation of this verse that we know about, and it's the one that seems to have been the most widely affirmed over the centuries. This reading contrasts in these respects with other translations that take Genesis 1:1 as a dependent clause. By the way, when I talk about how the text had been translated and interpreted over the years, I'm not just talking about Christian translations and interpretations. Jews and Christians widely agreed on how the text can be best translated and interpreted. And in this video, I will demonstrate that. Okay, let's start by looking at how this verse was translated in the Septuagint. NRK epoiesen ho theos ton uranon kai tein gein. In the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth. Here the verse stands as an independent clause, complete with a subject, a finite verb, and a predicate. From these points, we can infer the following. First, the Septuagint translators construed reshit as an absolute rather than a construct noun. Second, they didn't think that the verse contained an unmarked relative clause after bereshit. Third, they didn't construe the verb after bereshit as an infinitive construct. They construed it as a finite verb, epoiesen. So, in other words, the Septuagint translators didn't notice any of the grammatical points that many modern interpreters claim to be so self-evident and indisputable. But if none of what I'm saying here makes any sense, I recommend going back and watching this video. Now, the Greek term arche, which is used here to translate reshit, is usually rendered into English as beginning. In the Septuagint's rendering of Genesis 1:1, it lacks the definite article. And yet, despite that, I think it should be understood in a definite sense. And that's because in a beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, would surely be so vague and unspecific as to raise the question of what exactly the author was trying to communicate. Bear in mind here that we can't infer from the mere lack of a definite article that the translators understood reshit as an indefinite noun. Arche was a monadic noun after all, so its definiteness would need to be defined by the context, not by the presence or absence of a definite article. Okay, and other early Greek translators and interpreters likewise understood Genesis 1:1 as a complete sentence or an independent clause. Let's look first at Philo of Alexandria, who wrote in the first half of the 1st century AD. Now, Philo doesn't provide his own translation of Genesis 1:1. He simply relies on the Septuagint. He is relevant to our study, however, because of how he interprets this verse. James Barr, in this article, shows that Philo did not interpret Genesis 1:1 as a dependent clause. And on a related issue, Philo seems to have believed in creation ex nihilo. This is disputed, but I think it's a justifiable inference. I've written an article that attempts to make that case, and plan to submit it for peer review sometime this summer. So depending on how long it takes to get that into print, I'll have more to say about Philo in, let's say, another year or two once the article has been published. For now, suffice it to say that Philo regarded God as uniquely eternal and ungenerated. In other words, uncreated. Okay, now let's look at Josephus' treatment of Genesis 1:1. He, too, understood the verse as a complete sentence, an independent clause. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This translation can be found at the beginning of his monumental work known as the Jewish Antiquities. In this work, Josephus provides a history of the world, relying largely on biblical narratives. When he does this, he claims that he's giving us a faithful interpretation. The Greek verb that he uses here to explain what he's doing is methermeneuo, which could be rendered as either translate or interpret. His work definitely has more the character of an interpretation than a translation, though. He generally paraphrases, expands, and even alters what's said in his sources, even his biblical sources. Also, with certain biblical books, he uses the Septuagint instead of the Hebrew. For the books of the Pentateuch, however, he generally uses the Hebrew. And in Genesis 1:1, his reliance on the Hebrew can be inferred from his use of the verb ektisen, he created, instead of the Septuagint's epoiesen, he made. But although he seems to be working independently of the Septuagint here, he does agree with the Septuagint in translating verse 1 as a complete sentence. And so, unlike many modern translators and commentators, he doesn't read into the verse an unmarked relative clause, and he construes beit resh aleph as a finite verb, not an infinitive construct. Like the Septuagint and Josephus, Theodotion and Symmachus, two other Greek translators from the ancient world, both rendered Bereshit as en arche. Only Aquila rendered it differently, as en kephalaio. This is actually a more literal way to translate the Hebrew, since both words derive from words that mean head, but it means basically the same thing as en arche, and would just be translated into English as in the beginning. None of these three Greek translators infer that the verse is to be read as an unmarked relative clause, and all of them read bet resh aleph as a finite verb. Aquila's translation is interesting for more than just that word kephalaio. Here's how he rendered the whole verse. En kephalaio epoiesen ho theos sun to urano kai sun ten gain. Before I comment here on what's going on syntactically, let me mention something briefly about Aquila and his translation of the Bible. Aquila was very unsatisfied with the Septuagint. He especially didn't like the fact that Christians were using it to support some of their doctrines, and so he took it upon himself to produce a new translation that he thought was more faithful to the Hebrew. And so he published a rather woodenly, word-for-word translation of the Hebrew. Now, we've got some pretty literal translations of the Bible in English, and most of them are quite well done. But any good translator will tell you that it's not always a realistic or even a reasonable goal to translate everything word for word. Aquila either didn't appreciate that fact or just didn't care. And so, for example, here in Genesis 1:1, his translation is syntactically nonsensical, and that's because he tries to represent in Greek this Hebrew particle et in both of its occurrences. When this particle is used in Genesis 1:1, it functions as a direct object marker, so it really can't be translated into Greek, just as it can't be translated into English. In other cases, however, the particle could function as a preposition. And in those cases, we can usually translate it into English with the word with. Aquila seized upon this fact and translated Genesis 1:1 with the Greek preposition soon, which also means with. So his rendering of Genesis 1:1 kind of makes sense if you know what he's trying to do. But as the text stands in Greek, it's syntactically nonsensical. A Greek speaker who didn't know any Hebrew would probably have read it like this: "In the beginning, God made with the heaven and with the earth." Now, since Aquila's translational technique here is obvious, there's no reason to regard his double use of the word soon as indicating anything significant about how he understood the verse. All we can infer is that he was trying to represent the untranslatable particle et. So this element of his translation can just as well be discarded for our purposes. And when we do that, his translation, like the other early Greek translations, was very much in keeping with the traditional understanding of the verse. His use of the finite verb epoiesen shows that he understood the verse as an independent clause, and thus that he did not understand the verb either as an infinitive construct or as the start of an unmarked relative clause. And since he didn't interpret the verb as an infinitive construct or as the start of an unmarked relative clause, he must have understood reshit as an absolute rather than a construct noun. The last Greek commentator that I'll mention here is the author of the Gospel of John. Now, we don't know whether this author knew any Hebrew. He most likely relied on the Septuagint when he rephrased the opening verse of Genesis like this: "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." The only thing I'll point out about this verse is that, like the other Greek translators that we've been discussing, the Fourth Evangelist shows no awareness of a translational dispute about whether Genesis 1:1 should be read as an independent or a dependent clause. His rephrasing simply takes for granted that Bereshit was construed as an absolute noun and that the verse should be read as an independent clause. Okay, so let me bring this video to a close by offering some concluding observations about these early Greek translators and interpreters. We've looked at the Septuagint, Philo, Josephus, Aquila, Theodotion, and Symmachus. And we also looked at the opening verse of the Gospel of John. None of these translators or interpreters picked up on any of the grammatical points that modern commentators claim to be so obvious and indisputable. None of them read reshit as a construct noun. None of them read an unmarked relative clause after bereshit. And none of them construed the verb bet resh aleph as an infinitive construct. All of them read verse 1 as an independent sentence, complete with a subject, finite verb, and predicate. Moreover, for our purposes, what's especially relevant about the translations by Theodotion, Symmachus, and Aquila is that these men were not only translating directly from the Hebrew, they were also self-consciously trying to improve or correct the Septuagint. And because of that, they were more than happy to depart from the Septuagint at any point if they found it to be unfaithful to the Hebrew. Theodotion and Aquila tried to give a quite literal rendering of the Hebrew, while Symmachus took a more idiomatic approach. And yet, as I said, none of them picked up on any of the grammatical points that modern commentators claim to be so obvious and indisputable. Right, so that's all I've got to say about the early Greek translators and interpreters of Genesis 1:1. In the next video, we'll look at how this verse was translated into Aramaic.